Have you ever felt like giving up? Have you ever felt like just giving up on something in life? Something that deep down you didn't want to give up on, but you just felt defeated and you felt like it wasn't worth it. Have you ever felt like giving up on a job, on a diet, on a marriage, on continuing education? Have you ever felt like giving up on hope, on faith? Now, I'm going to ask you to sit on that question for a minute, and I'll come back to it. For a moment, let's look deeper into today's gospel from the book of Matthew. Now, the context of this parable is Matthew 25. And Matthew 25, if we go back a week to where Matthew 25 began, it begins with this simple sentence. Jesus saying to his disciples, "The kingdom of heaven will be like this." The kingdom of heaven will be like this. And then I would expect Jesus to then say, the kingdom of heaven will be like a place of goodness and mercy, a place where all are fed, all are loved, and all are equal. I expect this kingdom of heaven to be filled with good things and good news. But what we get instead are two difficult parables that follow in Matthew 25. Now, the first came a week ago, and if you attended worship a week ago, you heard Jesus say, the kingdom of heaven will be like this, followed by a parable about 10 bridesmaids, 5 of whom were called foolish in the Bible, because those 5 didn't have enough oil for their lamps. And at that day and at that time, weddings, which typically took days, meant that some people would have to kind of wait outside of a banquet hall and wait to be called or invited in. And so these bridesmaids, they didn't have enough oil to wait on the groom to come out. And so when the wise ones told the foolish ones to go get oil so that they could be invited into the wedding banquet, they went, they got oil, the groom came, and they were nowhere to be found. And then when they get back, they knock, and they ask to be let into this wonderful wedding banquet. But you know what? The groom said to them, "I do not know you." They knocked and asked to be let into a banquet, and the groom said to them, "I do not know you." So the kingdom of heaven is like that? And then we have today's parable, the parable of the talents. And this too is a difficult parable. And I think it makes us ask a lot of questions, or at least I think it ought to. Like, what did Jesus mean? And how is this parable about wealth and how to invest it? What does that have to do with the kingdom of heaven at all? Now, you may want to ask why we need to question this gospel at all. Why can't we accept this parable for what it is? Well, I think that we have to question it because it just doesn't add up. And because Jesus is the one who told it to his disciples. It was Jesus who seemed to be comparing himself to a wealthy master of slaves. It was Jesus who put these unusual expectations on the slaves in the parable. It was Jesus who said that the slave who didn't multiply his talent would be condemned and cast out and told that he was useless. So as thinking people of faith, I think we have to ask what Jesus meant in the parable today. This parable today, it doesn't sound like Jesus. It doesn't sound, I think, like good news. And it doesn't sound like what I imagine the kingdom of heaven to be like. As in most parables, the master who owns these slaves is kind of like Jesus. We can make that metaphoric leap. And he tells his disciples a parable about this wealthy master who goes on a journey. But before he leaves, he entrusts his excessive wealth to his slaves. Now, the Bible uses the word entrust, which I think would imply that these slaves have an expectation to invest and to multiply what they have been given. And so he gives the slaves an amount based on their abilities, and then the master, he leaves. And after a long time, he comes back to see what his slaves have done with the wealth that they have been given. Now, 2 of the slaves, as we know, doubled the amount that they've been given, and 1 does not. And as we heard, the master exalts the 2 who have multiplied the wealth and condemns the one who had not multiplied it at all, but had buried it. So a little context might be helpful. A talent was worth a ton of money, 6,000 denarii to be exact. Now, that would have been a lifetime of wages for these slaves. 1 talent would have been equal to like a lifetime of wages. But to condemn the one who didn't want to take a risk with that amount of money, why was the master so condemning, so harsh to this 1 slave? Now, again, why we have to question this parable is because this example of a condemning master doesn't sound like Jesus. Because Jesus didn't have any wealth to give out to anybody. And because Jesus' mission wasn't about investing wealth at all. And so we have to question. We have to look beyond the parable. This is not a parable about wealth and how we invest it. And I would say it's not even a parable about how to use one's gifts to their fullest, maximum ability and potential, which is often how we look at this parable. This is a parable about emulating a master, about copying a master. This is a parable about living in the ways of a master, doing the things that you've been taught how to do, multiplying the good things that you've been given. And it's a parable about not giving up on this, even when you might feel like doing so. So Jesus knew. He knew that soon enough his disciples would be all alone without him to lead them. He knew that he would die and rise again and then ascend to heaven. And then they'd be all alone. They would be all alone in a world that rejected the values that Jesus had taught. Those values are to love one's enemies, to care for the widow and the orphan, to give health to those with illness and disease, to provide for those who are poor and in need, to forgive as God has forgiven. See, those were the values that Jesus had to give. He didn't have wealth and money to give to anybody, but he did have a new way of living and loving and being and forgiving in the world. He had these values that he wanted them to invest in, to multiply, to emulate. These values were the wealth that Jesus wanted them to multiply. And he knew how difficult it would be for them when the world stood against them and they felt like giving up. Now, to come back to my initial question, do you ever feel like giving up? Because if you do, you're like any one of Jesus' disciples. He knew the road that lay ahead for them, and he knew that they would want to give up. He knew that they would want to give up and that they would want to lose faith and trust and hope. He knew that they would lose the ability to believe that he was still with them in spirit, still guiding them. And so Jesus, he uses this vivid, shocking language in a parable about investing talents to kind of wake them up, to give them a wake-up call, to say, hey, you're going to be alone. You're going to feel like giving up. Don't do that. Don't be like that one slave who buried his talent and lived in fear. Don't be like that. Don't give up. Take the values that I'm giving you. Take the wealth that I'm giving you. Emulate me. Continue on this path, even when you think that the world is against you, even when you feel like giving up. Keep going. Because these disciples, flawed and hesitant as they may have been, were still called to emulate Jesus. They were still called to be his hands and feet when he was gone. And he had to find a way to move them, to motivate them to faithful living, even when they didn't think that they could, even when they felt like giving up. So Jesus, well, he gives us. He gives us this unique kind of wealth too. He tells us to feed the people who need food, to clothe people who need clothed, to help people in need of health and hope and compassion, to love those who seem unlovable. He tells us to take his wealth, his values, his ways of making a new kingdom on earth, and to multiply that wealth, to stay on the path, to keep living and loving and forgiving even when we feel like giving up. He tells us not to give up, not to bury that wealth, not to be afraid, but to believe that any time that we try to emulate Jesus, that this kingdom of love and hope and peace will indeed multiply, and the world will be better because of it.